Welcome back to Henry Felix Discourses, where we talk about CRT and the damage it's doing to schools. I've got a feeling this one might be a little bit long, so I'm going to put timestamps in the description below for your convenience. Now, if you want to follow along with the pamphlet that I'll be talking about, I'll leave a link to this page. And what you do is you go down here and click Read the Report. Okay, right there. And then you'll be able to download the PDF. There are also documents on the curriculum, which is what we'll be talking about in part. And what you do there is, just really quickly, you go to academics and you go up to departments and courses and you see these two guides. When you click those, if you click for the lower school one, you get this. Click on that and you get the PDF. The upper school one looks just the same. You click on that. However, it takes you to this website, which isn't that convenient to read. So if you go to the very bottom of that page, it looks like this, and down here it says Upper School Curriculum Guide. Click that, and you go to a place where it has the PDF, and you can either read it on the screen or download it there. So, the topic for the day is whether Winsor actually takes all of this seriously. And this is a question for a lot of schools. So again, we're not just focusing on Winsor because it's Winsor. It's because Winsor represents a lot of schools. It's typical of a lot of schools. So a good place to start is the curriculum. Is this stuff actually in the curriculum? So this is the lower school curriculum. We'll go down. They've got all the things out there. And I'm going through, and I don't see that much. This is basically a solid curriculum. It's even got a Shakespeare play. At one point I was talking about a Shakespeare play. What if you forget that? Well, apparently they don't. There it is. That's great. That's in the 8th grade, right when you should be learning that. History, we've got ancient Greece and Rome in grade 6, which is a great time to study that. Early American history, cultural traditions and encounters, etc. I mean, this is a great curriculum. The one thing I probably want to add to maybe ancient Greece and Rome is something about how that was one of the main reasons, things that the founding fathers looked at when they're writing the Constitution. So they had a written Constitution and one that was based on a republic and not just a pure democracy and so forth. But this is a great curriculum. This looks very good. Mathematics, same thing. Very good, and DEI is noticeably absent. Science, pretty much the same thing. Now it says Darwin's development of natural selection. Now I put this in because all the way back here in that appendix where science had to talk about how DEI is being applied in science, it says in Class 3 Science and Class 5 Biology, genetic principles are used to illuminate the fact that race is a social construct. And I was disputing that, and I noticed that they talk about in Class 3 lower school, well, they mention natural selection, but nothing really about genetics. So I wonder where that comes from. Is that coming from the administration? Is it something they talk about, but they don't put in the curriculum? I don't know. But I think they're teaching a pretty standard curriculum, which is a compliment because that's what you need in the lower school. And this is, everybody else would call this a middle school, but in their lower school, that's the kind of thing you need. That's what a real education is at that time. World languages, great. These descriptions give you a good feel for what's there. Latin, very strong on that. All this, we're going down, down, down. We just keep going. All the arts, which I was complaining about a little bit. These are great descriptions, including performing arts. These are very solid. They're very specific about what they do, and it's really about how you perform. I mean, it's not fluff. If that's what you want to study, that is not a just nothing course at all, I don't think. Here we go. We get down to music, and well, there we go. Okay, didn't see too much sign of all that. Health and wellness. This is a very standard health class. You'd find that anywhere. It's good. Physical education is basically a schedule, the kind of schedule you might have. All right, upper school. This is the PDF, and I brought that back to the top. So if we go down here, we find a lot of the same. Okay, good strong curriculum actually. We've already talked about literature in this to some degree. There's a little bit of this stuff in here. We've got the personal is political. There's feminism. Is that bringing politics in? Well, it's hard to complain about that too much at an all-girls school. Should that be a college course? I don't know, but Anyway, for the most part, this is all strong. African literature, we've already seen this. I wanted to highlight this part again about Russian literature. A satirical novella making fun of Soviet science bureaucracy and masculinity. You'll know why in a little while. I'll be talking about masculinity because they're shooting a blank on that one a little bit. There is kind of a crazy, you can say stuff about Soviet ideas of masculinity and everything, but I think they're saying a little too much. And the real reason for this, when you're looking at CRT type people and DEI type curricula, they're not saying that there's something wrong with socialism or communism. They're saying there's something wrong with the application of it, the implementation of it, the management of it. But they don't get to saying that there's something wrong with it. And here, there's this going on, but they also have an erasure of male and feminine, masculine and feminine. They do try to do that to some degree with words like comrade or citizen. So that's just not completely true. It probably is completely true for the novella they're talking about, so I don't want to be overly critical, but just keep that in mind a little bit if you don't mind. Okay, there's more. We really talked about a lot of that. Coming down, everything's pretty much, ladies' night in Wakanda. Why not have a course like that? Have fun once in a while. I know if you want to get a strong education, you can find that in pretty much any school. Just make sure you take the hard courses and you'll get a good education. All right, history. This is where the highlights start building up a little bit. Now, I don't want to go too far with this and analyze this piece for piece, but we've got that word empathy again, ding, ding. Social and identity groups at the center of the national debate. So we're talking about current events. We are talking about DEI. That is part of it for United States history. That's a central concept. Indian history. I just put in diverse history because I'm wondering what diverse history is. Everybody has diverse history. Is this just a word that we use a lot? Here, diversity and vibrancy of African culture. I put this in because vibrancy is another one of this collection. There's a cloud of words that just gets drawn on all the time in DEI and CRT, and vibrancy is one of them. It's a cliche that you say vibrancy like that of African culture. You can use it a lot, but it's just a word that comes up a lot. And when you hear certain words, you kind of know what language somebody's talking, right? The art of protest, okay? It's not illegitimate in itself, but is it something for a high school or is it really a college class? It's definitely an activist topic, and it says something that maybe the history department is a little bit activist. Continuing on, here we've got politics of identity. That's definitely DEI, examination of race, class, and gender. Notice class, by the way, because this sneaks in a couple places here where class is a signal that, again, that CRT comes from critical theory. Critical theory comes from Marxism. So CRT is really taking something where in critical theory there was a class struggle and making it into a race struggle. And there's an indication of that. Each student will develop possible approaches to addressing social inequalities by taking a stand on an issue of importance to her in her local, state, or national community. Okay, very activist, just pointing that out. Genocide and collective violence. Okay, construction of collective identities. So here we are with the social construct concept again. And then whether hatred and violence against others are necessary components in the process of building community. So this is the idea of the other. So I'm pointing these out not to criticize these individual courses, but just to show that this is the general tone of it. Ideas like social constructs and the other and so forth. This is what's really imbued in all of these. So, impact of the global economy. So we've got globalism in there too. City on the Hill. So this is a little bit of criticism of American culture in a way. Topics such as affordable housing, food deserts, transportation, education, healthcare. Students will be required to conduct neighborhood profiles outside of class time that explore the complexities of urbanization. So that is current events, activism. And then invited speakers, okay. Maybe there's a little bit of a name-dropping flex there, but it also just reinforces that we're not talking history so much as we are current events and activism. Mathematics, again, pretty strong. This is pretty standard, pretty strong, well developed. That's what we want to see in a school, I think. Computer science, same thing. It's very concrete, very specific, very clear. Something I think is very valuable. Also, science. Now, I've highlighted genetics, okay, and just for this reason. If we go back to this again, we'll see class 5 biology, genetic principles again. And this is class 5 biology, and they mention genetics, but they don't really have that as a big topic. So that they're proving social constructs and all that, that's not really the big topic. It's really genetics, which I'm assuming is stuff like Mendelian genetics and so forth. That kind of thing, learning about it, learning the brass tacks of it. And that overlay of DEI doesn't seem to be here. Not in paper, not on paper, in the curriculum. Whether it's really there or not, I don't know. But it seems a little bit like maybe that was advertising there. So going down chemistry, we keep going, and we get to engineering 1 and engineering 2. Why did I highlight these? Mostly because of what's absent. You may remember when we did science way back, where it says in engineering design, students participate in human-centered design projects that require engagement with diverse communities in order to better understand and serve their needs. At that time, I was saying it sounds a little bit like someone from the engineering department needed to come up with something for this, and that's what he came up with. And I feel like that's accurate because there's nothing in here about that. They're talking about real, actual engineering, the things that you really do in engineering. And it looks like a very strong program. I think you would learn a lot in that program. API biology, we've got genetics in there again. It's just listed off. Okay, make of that what you will. And then goes on. Here we have the languages. Okay, they seemed to be a little bit rebellious in that earlier part where they did their description of having a real multicultural, a genuine multicultural look at things, rather than the fake one that gets put forth by proponents of DEI. And you get a really good sense for all of these courses. They're really well described. You know what you're getting into with these, and they all sound great. Just going to keep going and going and going. I put in this, personal and public identities. Now, if I were just doing like a search for like the word identity, let's see how many times that comes up, and that would be an unfair thing to do, to just look for the word and say, oh, there's the word identity, so that's DEI. This is not DEI. They're talking about personal and public identities, which is the real way that you talk about identities. And that's a perfectly legitimate topic. That's a good one. You do, because they're talking about how, global challenges, science, contemporary life, personal and public identities, families and communities. These are topics. You do have a personal and a public identity. And that does not have to do with your race. That has to do with what your outward showing is to the rest of the world. Okay, so I point that out because they do mention it, but it's not DEI. And it looks like the kind of thing that you want to be studying. So drawing and painting, so this is arts. Look like really good programs. Don't see much sign of DEI actually in this, not even in performing arts. Okay, I put, this is the performing arts, block offerings. Now I put this in, I noticed this because it says students split up to work on different projects based on their individual interests. Great, that's exactly what you should do. That's perfect. I'm completely in favor of that personally, and I think everyone would be. That's like how you teach and how you learn. That's especially in something that's expressive. That's awesome. It's not saying they divide up according to their identity group and then come up with something to express something about race or DEI or their identity or whatever. That's not what it is. That's not that kind of confining thing that I was complaining about when we saw performing arts in that appendix before. So, well, good, and I still don't really see DEI. So health and wellness, well, they talk about social constructions of gender, sexuality, identity. That's definitely a modern DEI kind of thing. But basically it's a regular health class. And you probably couldn't really avoid talking about that because it is a topic and people probably have questions about that. How does this really, because you hear about it all the time. So whether it's true or not, it's a topic that will probably be discussed. I mean, lots of things that aren't true or being debated can be talked about. I think that's legitimate. Learning experience. Oh, and then that gets into the, senior year. Okay, so this makes you wonder whether they're really taking it seriously or is that just all lip service? And I think one of the best places to start is with what they say. So on the report on Lift Every Voice, when they describe what they describe here, this paragraph is basically talking about how it will be in every part of school life. That's the summary of that. It's going to be everywhere. That is DEI, and it's the first thing they talk about. Okay, now, not just that, but when we get to, here we are, first page, mentioned this before, but Winsor School is deeply committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion practices at both the institutional and individual levels and has been for decades. So they're making that claim that we've always been here. Okay, well, commitment to DEI is a personal matter. Okay, so they're demanding more of the teachers than just do your job and teach DEI. They want it to be personal. You've got to be committed. And that's more than just normal, really. If you don't agree, then you're wrong and maybe you need to go. I highlight totality because I was talking about that word whole and holistic and totalitarianism in the sense that originally totalitarianism had that concept of something like holistic and whole. So looking at the whole picture and coming up with a whole solution. So everybody knew totalitarianism was Italy and everything and Mussolini. But the good part, the good billing of it was the idea that they're taking a total look at everything and coming up with a total solution, not leaving anything out, not just doing stuff halfway anymore. And that's something that runs through this. We see that word coming up, and it definitely appeals to people who are into CRT and critical theory and Marxism. They like the idea of all of problems being solved. Everybody participates. There are no exceptions. It's really very much of an anti-individualistic concept. And we can also look at this. So this is about someone who is now the director of community and inclusion, talking about how in 1999, making this claim that it's always been around, or for a long time. We had something at that time called Community Curriculum Day, which was a day devoted to talking about some diversity and inclusion issues. To me, what's happening here is Julian is stretching the truth. I wasn't there, obviously, but Community Curriculum Day is not really about diversity and inclusion. And I was around in 1999. I don't think that would have been the number one thing. Not really. Now, they don't say that those words actually appeared on the document that they were reading or it was on the board or anything like that. They say that it's, Julian says it's diversity and inclusion issues. So I think what's happening is that we've got a little bit of revisionist history going on where we were basically talking about that at that time on Curriculum Day. Then it goes on to say the topic was white heterosexual privilege. I don't know about you, but that doesn't quite seem to fit with DEI to me. It doesn't seem like they've always been there with this. It seems like they were talking about an issue that would have been pretty typical to be talking about in 1999. So I think there's a little bit of a stretch there. And if they're going to make that stretch, then if you're going to say, well, CRT isn't explicitly taught in the schools, but the issues are through DEI, which is what I'm saying, and I'm not the only one. This isn't just my theory. Well, he's doing the same thing. I'm assuming Julian is a he. He's doing the same thing by saying it's the issues that matter. And it is the issues that matter. So maybe they were kind of talking about diversity and inclusion, and they're basically talking about CRT here. Anyway, moving along, not to get too bogged down on that. Principles of diversity. Now, a lot of this is has a blathered quality where it's just stuff and things that are kind of forgettable. But I noticed this in particular here: anti-racism, the disruption of all systemic oppression. I just did it myself. There's a difference between systemic and systematic. Systemic means it's part of the system itself, and you can only get rid of it by taking down the entire system. That's definitely the revolutionary part of CRT. You can't have liberation or real equality until you've destroyed the entire system, brought it to its foundations, after which, as if by magic, things will just grow up and be perfect, because they're not specific about how that happens. And I would argue that doesn't just happen naturally if you just destroy everything. That doesn't work that way. Systematic would be more as, with a process that you do systematically. So that's the difference. But anti-racism, okay, again, that is not being against racism. That is counterbalancing racism with other racism. So these are things that are important to them. Bringing in more racism to somehow cancel out old racism or other racism and disrupt systemic oppression, the only way you can do that is really by disrupting the system itself and destroying it, preferably. Anyway, that's clearly a CRT concept being put into practice here. And interestingly enough, to teach, they've got essentially the same thing right here: actively seeking to dismantle systems of oppression. So that's very important to them. Now, voices, this quote I want to just point out because it says DEI efforts are happening in so many different pockets of the school each and every day. That just goes to show that it really is throughout the school. It's part of everything. They want it to be part of everything. This person is asserting that it is part of everything. Maren Kelsey, I don't have any idea who she is, but Maren, I'm sure you're a great teacher, but as far as the rest of this, that's a lot of words to say, not too much. Anyway, principles of global responsibility. We already talked about this in the thing about the global citizen. So if you want to hear more about that, then that'd be the place to go. But I just want to mention again, we have social justice and human rights, steward for the natural environment. These are concepts that are above and beyond the school and really the government. It's more like a world government. It's for everybody. It's the next level up. So just a little reminder of that is all, as a theme, one of these themes that keeps coming back. Who we are, faculty and staff. Now, I think we've already seen that they are in favor of DEI, but this is where the brass tacks come in. Here we've got what's the most prominent thing on this page of these graphs. And this is a head count of race. BIPOC staff, BIPOC faculty. Down here, white staff, BIPOC, white faculty, BIPOC faculty. Just numbers. And that's how they view diversity. That's what DEI is really all about. It's a head count. And I think that 20 years ago, this would probably have been crazy to see in any pamphlet anywhere. It's like, let's just give you a list of who's black, who's white, who's Hispanic, and so forth. Once you start reading so much of this, it starts to seem normal. And by normal, I mean normal in the way we normally think of the word normal, not as a statistical thing, which is what their thing is, which we'll see in a minute. We would not think that would be normal, and it's not. It's not normal, okay? Anyway, modeling perspective and connection. This is about how teachers should be. Now, when I look at this as a teacher for 20 years as a teacher and then years after that as a tutor, I think of modeling as something like, well, you model being truthful, you model being respectful, you model being hardworking, you model being, on time, speaking well, speaking clearly, following through on things. That's all modeling, and it's a huge part of teaching. They will do what they see you do. If you say something and don't do that same thing, they'll notice and they'll realize that you're just not very sincere about that. However, what they mean by modeling is students see representatives of themselves in the community. So they're talking about race again and ethnicity or whatever other identity group you want to talk about intersectionally, and there are plenty of them. So that's what they mean. It's not what you think or how you act, it's who you are. And we've got it in the graphs, and we just have it again. Perspective. First time I looked at that, I wasn't sure exactly what they meant by perspective. You kind of have to see what their answer is and then come back and say, oh, now I know what they mean. Diversity of viewpoints. Well, they said diversity of viewpoints, so we're good, right? Because that's what we need. Well, no, because to them, diversity of viewpoints is diversity of ethnicity. There is only one viewpoint in DEI. Everybody has to conform to that. When they say diversity of viewpoints, they're talking about how your viewpoint or your perspective comes from your identity, be that ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, whatever else, that defines your perspective. Not your brain, not your reasons. So even though they say diversity of viewpoints, sure, a person of a certain intersectional profile might have viewpoints, but it's not because that person has thought about them. It's really just because of who they are. That's a completely different idea from the Enlightenment idea of looking at things objectively, using your reason to come up with viewpoints. Totally different. Connection. If I think of connection, I would say, well, that would be building a rapport with students. That would be knowing something about them, whether they like model cars or whether they like baseball or whatever else, so that when you talk to them, maybe you've got a little thing to talk about. It means using a little bit of humor in the classroom. Not too much, but just a little, and make a connection. To them, we have to mirror, as best as possible, the world in which we live. And mirroring the world in which we live is talking about being physically someone that they can count heads with. So your race, your ethnicity, your any other identity will be something that they can count up and see in the world too, statistically. These are completely different ideas from what we would normally think of as modeling, perspective, and connection. And they all basically come down to the same thing: race, race, and race, or ethnicity, ethnicity, and ethnicity. Identity group, and identity group. However you want to put it, it's not these things. So, who we are, the student body. Now, can you guess what they're going to say about that? Well, look at this. Down here, the head count. How many Asians do we have? How many Black African Americans? How many Hispanics? Numbers. That's what matters. First and only main, 100% main thing that matters to them. They've got the numbers. And again, I think that would have been pretty shocking to see 10 years ago, 5 years ago. We're just going to give you the numbers like this and just say, this is our student body, just defined by race. It's a little bit crazy. But if that's not dehumanizing enough, think about when they look at these numbers and they say, you know what, we don't have enough Middle Easterners. We don't have enough Middle Eastern students. We want to boost that number. So our school is of a finite size. So where's that going to come out of? Where do we go for these numbers? Well, I don't know, Hispanic, we could probably use a few more of those too. Black, African American, I think we want to lower that number. Well, Asian, look, that's getting on towards how many whites there are at the school. And, Asians as percentage of the population aren't that much. So, yeah, we can easily take a few of those. Why don't we take 3 or 4 of those? Yeah, make it 4. So that way we've got double digits on Middle Eastern next year. That's up to 10. That looks good. Hispanic, maybe we can get that to 25. We'll just take a few more here. Nobody will really notice. So the individual doesn't matter anymore. It's just who you are ethnically, and they'll move numbers around. That's completely dehumanizing. Voices. How are we going to make sure that we actually live that commitment? So this is about, the commitment to DEI. How can we make sure that we actually live that commitment? Really is making sure that the numbers work. Okay, so what we teach. This is going to be interesting. All right, this is going to be interesting. I was surprised by this. A little confused and then surprised. So the 9 academic departments are history, mathematics, etc. We've been through each one of them. All right, now let's just look at what they say about each one. Examination of linguistic racism in the English department. Well, that kind of fits with them. They were pretty embracing of this and linguistic racism. Do they mean in the English department itself, or do they mean the English department will look at linguistic racism? I'm not sure, but certainly the words do matter, but they're really important to CRT and really the Soviet style of thinking about how you express yourself. The words really matter to them. Anyway, revised wellness activities. So culture, identity, and social justice is pointing out that they take wellness and they basically just plug in culture, identity, and social justice, and they just stick it in. And I'm not sure if it really fits, but I want to also point out that this isn't DEI, is it? It's three other words. They do have more than just those three, and social justice is a classic for that. Sustainability is another one. And they do a lot of mix and matching in the world of DEI, where they come up with their own sort of preferred whatever list. Sometimes it's got 4 words, sometimes it's got 3. It doesn't really matter too much because none of the words really mean what they say in general. And it's not very clear. But anyway, that's very typical and very characteristic of the DEI movement, that you mix and match like that. Broader and more diverse inclusion of artists. They did say that in their thing. And so that's having people come in and see them, I guess. There's nothing wrong with that. I really already talked about that. Anyway, next, the application of a diversity ally pact between the teachers and students. This is the performing arts. But let's read that again. Diversity ally pact between the teachers and students. Now, if you saw my thing on the discourse on the performing arts, I had something to say about that. And I was saying this. Let's just go back to it. I was saying this ally pact came across to me at first as like, well, something that the students have to sign, basically. But then reading it closely, it says, well, finally, the teachers in the performing arts share a DEI ally pact with our students at the beginning of every course that expresses our commitment to see each student as an individual and to be held accountable for actions that do not convey our respect for them. So this is, I was saying, well, it kind of sounds like it's something that they present to the students that they've taken for themselves, that they're offering as something that they are showing to the students. Now, it's something that is definitely signaling a little bit. We're the best and greatest and most progressive of all, because not only do we talk about it and not only do we put it into practice, we've actually got a written pact about it. I assume it's written. But it's from us to them. However, by the time it gets through this, the rest of this pamphlet, it's a diversity ally pact between the teachers and students. So after all, they are kind of forced into this, aren't they? They have to. Can you really say no to that? I'm thinking probably not. I'm thinking that if a student wanted to say no, that would be a little bit of a shock to the teachers because they expect accolades for this pact. They expect, gold stars for this. And have somebody say no would be, I think, a little bit of a shock, and they probably remember it. And what would the parents say to that student coming home and saying, I don't really want to sign this diversity ally pact or agree to it, and for these reasons, 1, 2, 3. Parents are probably going to say, don't do that. Just go along with it. Just give them what they want. Just say yes, okay? Because we just don't want anything that will mess things up for when you're applying for colleges. Whether there's something that would go into a folder or maybe not go into a folder, it'll go into people's memories. And if you think parents are paranoid that somebody will remember that, they're not being paranoid, because the girls will have to come back and ask for recommendations. And if they're taking performing arts a lot, then they're going to need those teachers for recommendations. And if they've said no to that teacher, the teacher will remember that, and they might not give a good recommendation. Or they might give the kind of recommendation where you can read between the lines about what the person really means. That does happen. And this thing, the parent would say, just go along with it. And so again, that is antithetical to the whole idea of individuality and thinking for yourself. And as it turns out, it is between the teachers and the students. So there's a little bit of coercion there. If you don't think students don't see this, think again, and I'll give you an example of this. I had a student years ago who was in the choir, and he was in the choir because everybody had to be in the choir. And not everybody was showing up for all the practices. Now, technically, you had to show up for all the practices too, but your parents, it was at the end of the day, and a lot of kids had parents who were writing them notes to say, we have to go do this or that, and they didn't care because it's just choir and big deal. And that was a little upsetting to the person who ran choir. Wonderful person, by the way. I think she maybe overstepped her bounds in this little anecdote a little bit, but otherwise she's a wonderful person and we have nothing wrong with her at all. But they were also not showing up early before performances that were given at night. So the parents would come at the last minute, drop the kid off. They weren't there for the practice that they do beforehand, weren't really there to get ready. And this was upsetting to her. And she was starting to say that you get a detention if you don't show up. And then she said, you made a commitment to be in the choir. And if you don't show up, you're violating that commitment. Well, one of my students came to me and he said, I never committed to being in the choir. I was told I had to be in the choir. He had a point. Okay, now if the school wants him to be in the choir and they want to say, if you don't show up, we'll give you detention, that's one thing. But to say we'll give you a detention because you made a commitment and then you didn't live up to it is a completely different thing. And you may, as an administration, be able to just force that to happen. And you may have teachers, parents who smile at you and say, that's great, thank you very much, because they don't want to ruffle any feathers because of college. But the student's going to notice, and people do notice. So I just want to point that out, that these things, you can't just slide these things in and expect everybody to be too happy about it. I think this is a place where they've really overstepped, that you just have this pact that you've basically got to sign. Anyway, next, an active exploration of ways to actively combat the use of science to justify discrimination in all its forms. Sure, but I didn't really see that. I think this is more the administration's idea of what they want them to be doing, and they'll probably be hearing about them, and they are, it's like, well, you're on the radar, I guess. In history courses, now I put this in a different color for a reason, not fire engine red, but a little bit red. In history courses, an emphasis on how learning is relevant to the lives of students and to the world they live in, as well as the department's commitment to emphasize depth over breadth in all courses. You see anything to argue with on that? Nope. That sounds fantastic. That's what concerns me, because it's a little bit like the opposite of something like science, who has a really strong curriculum and seems to be paying lip service to the administration, or performing arts, who is coming right out with all these things like the Diversity Ally Pact. That's right on the surface, that's plain to see. This is ignoring it completely. And I think of all the courses, if you go back and look at the history one, this might be, if I may use a word, the wokest one. Even in the curriculum, you can see it. They're really embracing DEI, and they're putting it in the curriculum and in black and white and on the page, unlike most of these other things. The whole problem was, all along, teachers were telling parents they were doing one thing in the pamphlet and they were doing something else in the classroom. And this is what's going on here, apparently. So, when kids had to go on Zoom, that's when people started to see what was actually happening in the classroom. And that's why people got rather shocked about DEI and CRT. And that started up this whole debate. Did for me too. I wouldn't have noticed. I didn't really notice until after I left teaching and start looking back on it. And I was really gone before all of this really came in anyway. But I also had the time to look into it. And this is exactly what was getting people upset. And it is a little bit concerning to me that they have the DEI and the CRT concepts all there. They're fully on board, and yet they give you this. This is something that you would read right past and you'd probably not even notice it. And if you did, you'd say, yeah, this should be talking about how history is relevant to us. And depth over breadth of course, that sounds great. So I really question whether that's fully honest intellectually. I really have to say. I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like it. What we've got on paper doesn't really sound like it. It sounds like flying under the radar. Now, it is in the same pamphlet that they describe being a lot more pro-DEI and pro-CRT. That is, however, in the appendix. And how often do people look at that? So I don't want to say anyone's lying. That's not what I'm really saying. But massaging, yeah. All right, anyway, continuing. An examination of the trajectories of Black and Latinx. I really just wanted to point out because, Latinx, last time I checked, only 2% of Latinos actually approve of this term. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. If you want to change the language, you would have to change the language in order to do that. And from what I understand, most of them don't want to do that. And the debate actually ought to be informed somewhat about the idea of what gender really is in a language, because the only way to have a gender-free noun or pronoun in Spanish, which only has two genders, masculine and feminine, you'd have to change the language. But it's not really the issue, because if we take a look at this, grammatical gender, some authors use the term grammatical gender as a synonym for noun class, and that's really what it is. The idea of gender was just sort of thought of at one point. Why don't we call it gender? Because in general, that you've got male and female, and you have those. But for the rest of the languages that are gendered, the genders don't really apply to anything. They don't make any sense. They're really just categories of nouns. So, and that's purely grammatical, and it's just happened to be that way. So you've got nouns that fall in some categories and other nouns that fall in other categories. Sometimes they actually go along with sex. Sometimes they don't. So you either have masculine, feminine. You might have masculine, feminine, and neuter. But there are actually further genders or noun classes in a language, such as vegetable even. There's some language in the South Pacific where vegetable is a gender. Grammatically, it's a gender. And strangely enough, the word airplane is in the vegetable class. And the reason is that planes used to be made out of wood, but not anymore. But they kept the gender. So none of them make sense. If you look at a word, if you go to German and you look at the word for Tisch, that's masculine. Tisch means table. The word table means Tisch, and it's masculine. But a synonym for table is Tafel, which is feminine. So if you're going to really get too wound up in that kind of a debate, it's really more than just how somebody feels about their own gender and whether they feel that applies to how they were born or not. It's a very funny debate, and it's too bad that there isn't a little more thought put into it. In Spanish, even if you want to say you're non-binary, you have to say you're either non-binario or non-binaria. So you've got the masculine and feminine forms of non-binary, unless you want to say something like non-binorex. And, let's just think about this as a debate. It reminds me a little bit of man versus woman. Why is the word man and the word woman? Well, look up the etymologies of man and woman, and you'll see why that was a really kind of a silly debate if it's about language. And if it's just about the superficiality of seeing the word man and the word for woman, then I guess you have a point. But in terms of where the word came from, you have no point. So Latinx, this is like one of these words that they just sort of paste on, and it doesn't sound like they've really asked anybody whether they want that or not. But they feel so strongly that that's what it should be, that that's just what it's going to be. Anyway, not to get too bogged down on that. We'll just keep right on moving. See if there's representative movement in sectioning into every level course that matches other groups. This is a little window into, I don't know what was going on. Because remember with mathematics, they said they're looking at how students from different racial and ethnic groups are represented in different levels of courses. They're not drawing any conclusions. They're just saying we're looking at it. I think there's resistance there, and I think there ought to be, because it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. That's really all there is to say about it. Next, the integration of current events and current topics in all the higher level language courses. Now, they do talk about DEI issues in the language courses. This may be driven by the administration more than anything else, but I noticed we have language courses here and language courses there. An exploration of different cultures in all world language courses. Why couldn't this be part of that paragraph? Well, they get 2 bullet points. Why would they get 2 bullet points? Is that because they were doing a lot of passive resistance in their description? Because it wasn't a DEI description. Is this a signal that they're on the radar? Or maybe. Could it be something else? Because they said there are 9 departments, right? Let's count them up. Bullet points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bullet points. But language is 2 of them. So something got left out. Can you think of what it was? The answer is athletics. 10 points if you got that right. Kind of the real question is why they left athletics out. All right, well, let's just remember for the moment that language got 2 bullet points. Maybe they're on notice here. I don't know. It's just a thought. Okay, because they want them to do DEI and they're kind of not really doing it. They've already got a good program and they don't really need to layer that on. And it'd probably just interfere with doing actual good teaching. But let's not forget about what it says here. School that is not normed on white supremacy. Now, by normed, they mean a statistical idea of norming. So what they're complaining about, where this came from really, is that if you think of an American and you think, if you say, think of an American and the first thing that comes to mind is a white person, then you're going by the statistical norm, more or less. That's not quite as precise as it ought to be, but that's the norm. And it makes sense because that's also the majority. Has been throughout the history of the United States and still is now. But they're saying it shouldn't be thought of as the norm because people of any race can be an American. True enough. Okay, but they're not saying that it's not normed on being white. They're saying it's not normed on white supremacy. Wow, why are they saying that? I mean, I don't think that Winsor is normed on white supremacy. And notice that the word normed, you could say based. They're not saying it's based on white supremacy. It's normed on white supremacy. And they don't want it to be normed on white supremacy. But this is a little bit like, when did you stop beating your wife type question. Since when has Winsor been normed on white supremacy? Like never, maybe? Maybe the first year, maybe when it was founded. I don't know, but I don't think so. Because that was 20 years after the Civil War, and I really don't think that white supremacy was part of the Winsor culture. Why is it there then? Well, there's a little bit of a threat, and there's a little bit of fear-mongering here. Because saying that there might be white supremacy coming in, white supremacy, that's something that gets everybody afraid. We've got to fight white supremacy. That's why we're here. It justifies their presence. We don't want white supremacy. It's like, okay, really? But it's also a little bit of a threat because, well, if you oppose us, the question's going to be, are you a white supremacist? Or do you think it's like partially okay? Or do you, is this something that was in your background? Or do you have any sympathy with it? You know, well, no, we're not saying anything, but we just have these questions. So this is where any opposition will result in an even greater accusation. And that's a climate of fear. So that's a threat. In that sense, it's a threat. On paper in black and white, well, of course we don't want a school normed on white supremacy. But why do you have to put it here? Why do you have to write it down? Why do you have to put it in as a huge quote right here? It's kind of a signal to everybody. Keep in line. All right. Library, well, we already talked about this, but I'll just mention again, it's, you know, they always have, the new books always has books related to DEI. This will be a permanent feature. It's always there. It's even in the library. It's going to be in your face all the time. And I'm not just saying it's in your face. They're saying for visitors and prospective families, it's front and center, which is, I guess, a way of saying in your face. It's a similar way of saying it anyway. So they want that front and center. Okay, but not just that. That's not good enough for you. They bought 600 copies of the selected book, were ordered from Frugal Bookstore, the only black-owned bookstore in Boston. So congratulations, Winsor School. You based your purchasing decisions on race. Continuing on, creating an inclusive learning environment. Now, these norms I was talking about before, where they were talking about norms, I said that they do mention norms, and all these norms are fine. I think this is a little bit of a flying under the radar thing as well. All these norms are fine. I don't have a single argument with any of them. Those would all be great things to have. But what are they really talking about in this class? And I think we get this from Julian Braxton again, Director of Community and Inclusion. Okay, who am I? How do we answer that question? Who am I in terms of my gender and gender identity? Who am I in terms of my racial identity? Who am I in terms of my class? So class is, again, getting back to communism and critical theory, Marxism. That's the class struggle becoming the racial struggle right here. Okay, we can just sort of work our way back. Class, race, and now we're adding in gender. There are many other identities you could put in. But I would think if someone said, who am I would be thinking more in terms of what my beliefs are, what my morals are, what my ethics are. Whether I have a creed or not. Those aren't the first things. The first things I wouldn't think are how I was born, what I think about how I was born, my racial identity, all the intersectional identities. Those are, again, people as objects, really, not as individuals, not as thinking individuals in the context of the Enlightenment, where objectivity and reason and individuality are the most important things. This is the opposite of that. So that's what's really happening. Be comfortable with discomfort. If we really wanted to get down to it, maybe we could say who's supposed to be uncomfortable. I don't know. But basically the norms themselves, the way they have them written down, are fine. I have questions about Julian Braxton's concept of what I am, or what I is probably a better way to put it. All right, inclusive language, very important to them. We've moved away from saying she, her, and hers, or your daughter, even though it's an all-girls school, because they want to be sensitive to all non-binary people, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and parent-guardian interview. I'm only mentioning this really because laying out how you're supposed to speak is something that would normally have been really more like a student handbook, where you're supposed to not use certain swears and stuff. But here they are, they're defining how you should talk, and that's an increasing thing. Every culture always has ways that you may or may not talk, and they're defining them in a different way. In that sense, it's just like any other culture, I suppose. But I don't know about you, but it seemed to me about 15 years ago that things like being too strict about words and stuff actually was starting to go away. And that for once, culture really was getting more free. I've long been of the opinion that humans are humans anywhere you go and any time period you're in. So if you get rid of certain restrictions, like that it's bad to swear or bad to use the Lord's name in vain, that kind of thing, those are bad. And you say, well, now they're okay. Well, something else will become bad. And for a while, it seemed like we weren't really doing that anymore so much. But now we are. Now there are words that are definitely bad words. They're the hurt words. And the hurt words change too, which makes things a little bit dangerous. And I guess they always change. But I just want to point that out because the words, this emphasis on how you address people, also fits in with that socialist idea. There's a Romanian fellow on YouTube who's always talking about Romania, and he talks often about, not always, often about the socialist days. And he talked at one point about how he would refer to other people as tovarish, which means tovarish, I guess, which means citizen. It does not refer to gender, but it also refers to you as someone subordinate to the state. So these words do matter. They matter a lot, and they matter more to them, I think, than they do to your regular, normal, individualistic, free-thinking American. It's a whole list of restrictions, and they can be confusing, and it sets you on edge, and it's intended to set you on edge. Because if you always have to ask about whether a word is going to be okay or whether you're going to get in trouble for it, then you're always a little bit on the defensive. You're always a little off balance, and they do want that. The real CRT people, they do want that. Learning styles, I threw that in just because they're almost throwing in everything. Sometime I'll talk about learning styles. What I'll do is I'll put 2 links in about learning styles, and you are free to look at those. But it doesn't really apply to this, but I'll put those in just for your viewing pleasure. Athletics. Here's athletics. Okay, so where were we again? We were in the part about creating an inclusive learning environment. So athletics got kicked out of the part earlier about the academic things. There are 9 of them. They were listed there, and then they weren't mentioned. But now they're here. We've already gone through this paragraph, but this is the part where they were saying, starting with the second one I've highlighted, their professional development increasingly in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So athletics, if you'll remember, in their description, they basically stiff-armed the whole thing. They just described their department, and that's it. And in the written curriculums, they basically just list out the kinds of things you would do at sports. So it's kind of a big reminder here. We're increasingly going to be putting you through professional development about diversity, equity, inclusion. So you haven't been listening so far, and we're going to make sure you do. And the first one that I mentioned, they give out a comprehensive coaching manual to ensure the proper use of language. That's a little bit insulting, but they want them to toe the line. They want them to toe the line. I don't think athletics really had to be in this section. It's an academic discipline, according to them, and it should have been in that part. But they've brought it out as, it seems a little bit like they've almost called it out a little bit, This is where language got 2 bullet points. You're on notice. Athletics, we're thinking about thumb screws. Okay, moving on. Life after Windsor, the path to college. Now, by the way, if you're a parent, you're probably going to breeze past all of that stuff and stop right on this page, because this is the most important thing to you. What are they going to do for my girl to get her into college? And they do have a pretty good program for that. Just thought I'd point that out, though. Connecting in community. All right. There are a few things to say about this, but I wanted to point this out in particular. I'm going to just read it. In instances in which a student's identity is used in a hostile or demeaning way or with intent to harm, the school will first seek to understand the student's needs and wants before taking action to remedy the situation. So what do we make of this? This is pretty much in the context of an advisory question where maybe somebody goes to an advisor and says that their identity was used in a hostile manner. And if it is, then that would be fairly clear-cut, I suppose. They've been called a name or something. It seems to be there's an assumption of taking some action, remedying the situation somehow. They do say they'll seek to understand the student's needs, but let's just be realistic here. Suppose a young woman of color is saying to an advisor that a friend said something like, "you people," or something. I don't know what, but something that kind of made her a little uncomfortable. Wasn't sure, a little uncomfortable. And the advisor might just say, "Wow, racism, that's terrible. We'll have to do something about it." And then you might say, "Well, no, I don't want you to do anything about it. I'm just wondering how I can handle it." And, "Well, you shouldn't have to handle it." "Yeah, but, she's a friend. I don't want to get her in trouble. Oh, but this is what people always say when they're the victim. They don't want the perpetrator to get in trouble. Now you see how quickly it's gotten into a point where the student didn't want to go. Maybe they'll say, oh, trust us. We'll just talk to her in a way that doesn't bring anything bad to you. We know how that works. You end up, it's just like with bullying. If you say something and then that gets passed on to the bully, well, then you're the snitch and things can only get worse. When parents called me saying that their child was being bullied, the first thing they would be saying is, we don't want this to be a big deal. We don't really want you to say anything to the person. And I would always assure them that we'll look at it. We'll just try to observe and try to catch it in action rather than saying, we heard that you've been bullying somebody. And that's kind of about all you can do most of the time. If they really demand something, and if there's been something specific, well, then that's another story. But this is very similar to that because, she said something that another student has done something to make her feel uncomfortable. But so maybe they'll say, well, we won't make a big deal of it, but we'll talk to her. That doesn't always work. What that does is that'll start to erode or even destroy that relationship with the other girl. And the other girl will most certainly talk to the parents about it, or the school will. And then those parents will hate the other parents, for one thing, or the friend anyway, because again, they'll be afraid that that's going on their child's record and that it'll be remembered for college. These private schools have maybe an informal agreement for maybe like, I don't know, 1 or 2 people going to Harvard every year. And if you're in the running for that and you've got anything on your record, well, you might be the person who gets out of the running on that. They're not wrong to be worried about that. So you could destroy that relationship. You could get the parents against each other. And ultimately, what the real problem is that the student will probably say nothing. Just say nothing at all. And because they're afraid that the school will be too zealous in pursuing it. And the way it looks right now, the number of times that they've mentioned things like DEI and the way they keep going on and on about it, I wouldn't blame her for feeling that the school might be getting too zealous. So I just wanted to mention that because there's looking for racism sometimes, looking for the hostility because they want to do something about it. And it can have a suppressive effect on everything as well. And I'm sure they've thought of it. And that's why they say they want to understand the students' needs first. But we've definitely gone too far with vilifying bullies, because that actually creates a blowback effect in various different ways. And I don't want to get into that whole thing right now. Maybe we will sometime. But I wanted to mention that. All right, assemblies, identity, equity, and social justice, of course. It's always everywhere. Students together, affinity groups. All right, so space for students who identify as part of an underrepresented group. Okay, well, there are a lot of them. And as an underrepresented group, that obviously doesn't include white students. And this is just another example of where they're grouping people that can really have a detrimental effect, because when you break people into groups, then they naturally start having attitudes. And you can just bring out issues that weren't there in the first place. I think a lot of people have said that when you do that, you really just make things worse. I think I'm on very solid ground to be saying that. Not just that, but this is a place where inclusion becomes exclusion, because now the whites have no affinity group, right? Yeah. All right, we're going to speed up because this is getting long, and we're just going to sort of move right along here. And you know who can't just speed up and move along because they're getting tired of it? Are the students, because this is going to be part of the day every day. These are the appendices. Again, we're going to go back. I'm going to go down here. I just want to mention a couple other things. The teachers do have affinity groups. There's white colleagues challenging racism. It's a forum for white members of the faculty and administration to consider issues of racism and privilege. identifying microaggressions and listening to speakers. So this is the uncomfortable questions group, right? Now there's colleagues of color. They celebrate our work as we support and sustain each other. Okay? I think that kind of speaks for itself. I know as a faculty member, I would not really think it would be a great idea to have those two groups. Certainly not as adults, not for anybody really, but I can imagine that happening and not thinking it would be a good idea. The Alumni Board's goal is to be more racially diverse. Now, if they just put a period, that would be maybe a little too obvious. It seems like they say, and regionally diverse. It kind of softens the blow, but that's the real idea, is racially diverse. They're going to allow people to not be in Massachusetts to join that, and that's what they mean by regionally diverse, but that's really to make it more racially diverse. So once again, race is all that matters. Now, look at this. Academic excellence. They put it in bold right here. Holistic is there, just mentioning that. We will continue to support the highest standards for Windsor's academic excellence. Well, I'm glad they mentioned it sometime, even if it's in Appendix G of their DEI curriculum statement. But look to the right. We will prioritize this work of supporting diverse and connected school community. So it's still more important to be diverse. These things here are basically more of that, and I'll just skip those. This I only wanted to mention because I thought it's kind of funny. We will continue to build financial strength and dexterity. First of all, it's a private school. Financial strength is always important to a private school. But also strength and dexterity. It sounded like somebody played a lot of D&D when they were a kid, because you have strength and you have dexterity. I don't know what financial dexterity is. That's kind of interesting. I can imagine maybe what it is, but it's like you have strength and you have dexterity when you're a D&D character. So, what'd you roll? I don't know. That made me chuckle. So I wanted to mention it. Now, so if we ask them, do you take it seriously? Sure sounds like they do. I would say, yeah, they do. They've put out this very well produced 100-page pamphlet about it, and they sure sound like it in the way they're writing it. It doesn't sound like it's just blather. I want to come back to this, but also let's go to this last thing here, the mission statement. Let's look at the mission statement. Well, mission statement here is the same boring mission statement that you'll find anywhere. You'll never remember a single word of it after a week. They're all the same. I worked on a mission statement in my school for weeks and months. We worked on that, and I couldn't tell you a single word from it, other than this probably says something about responsibility, because they all do. I have no idea. This is a weird page, though, because it's just mission and vision, okay? And it's got the mission statement, and then the strategic vision. That's not a button, though. Maybe it was supposed to be. But here it is, principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yeah, this is all word for word what is in that DEI book, pamphlet, whatever we want to call it. Principles of Global Responsibility, word for word, same thing. And they add in accreditation and affiliation. So these are all the people that they're with. And a little bit, this is an appeal to the group, I guess, appeal to authority, I suppose, because your appeal to the whatever that is, which can be a fallacy, but they are doing that. They've got a long list of people. Top one is NAIS, National Association of Independent Schools. They are pushing DEI a lot, and these affiliated groups, these friends of yours, can also become your masters, because if they're going to push DEI and you don't want to, they can unaccredit you, and then you're kind of on your own. You have to explain that. You want that accreditation. I mentioned that before, about how you join a group. That was with NEPSAC, with the athletic department. All of a sudden they're coming back with DEI, and you don't want to be cut out of NEPSAC, even though originally it was just something to enhance the school. So these people are also pushing it. But as far as I can tell, the administration, anyway, of the school, with some pushback from parts of faculty, are absolutely fully on board with CRT and DEI. I don't think that's unclear. And what we'll be talking about next is hiring and firing, and that will be something that will reinforce how they mean to carry this through. They're not just fooling around. This is not just something where this is not just one of these fly-by-night things. That's what I thought it was originally. And you can be forgiven for not just immediately saying, even as I'm just going through all these discourses, just being on board with me and just saying, well, I got to think about that. And I agree with that. You should. And it's hard to just really see that this is what's really happening is actually very bad. It's a very strong movement. It's not a deep movement, but it's a strong movement. But I was in exactly the same boat. I thought it was just another one of these things. DEI is just the new whatever. It's just the next thing they talk about. They'll kind of come and go, and it's the same thing it's always been. No, it's not. It's very different. It really goes back to Marxism, and that Marxism is a very vicious ideology, and it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop anywhere, and it doesn't care about the individuals that they're dealing with. It doesn't care about Winsor School. It doesn't care about people of color. It cares about carrying out Marxism. It cares about creating more little Marxists for the army. And I know that's a lot to take in, and I don't blame you for saying, no, that's too much. That's not true. Maybe there's a little bit of this is true, but not that. And that's fine. I'm not expecting you to just suddenly, think of that way. But the more you learn about it, the more you see how that's true. And it isn't something that is inevitable, not by any means. There still is that curriculum that Winsor has. We can go back to that. In the end, in the long run, the Enlightenment wins. Reason and objectivity eventually win. It's just we don't want to go through 70 years of this the way the Soviet Union did. And by the way, we're all alone on this. Even the French don't want to hear about this. This is really an English-speaking world Western concept that we're kind of pushing out on the rest of the world, trying to anyway, and it's not working very well. And certainly Marxism is not welcome really anywhere in the world. And by that I mean, you go to Eastern Europe, you go to Russia, they don't like Marxism or communism. They've been through it. They've seen it. Africa, I can say a little bit less about that. That's a much more confused situation, but I don't think there's a whole lot of support for it. Chinese who are from China don't like it. I mean, sure, the country is nominally communist and mostly still is now, but North Koreans, no, they don't like it. South Americans, they have some pretty leftist governments, but even they know that that's just milking the system, and the real thinkers down there are not on board with it. And if you go to, say, Quora and go to the Spanish section, when somebody talks about socialism, they're going to get a lot of pushback on that. Okay, take people from Venezuela, Cuba. None of them are in support of this. It's only us. We're all alone on this. Okay, this is not the vision for the world. This is not a globalist perspective, only for a very small group of people, and some people who are kind of in the WHO and the UN, and they've always been there, but they're always pushing for it. But this is not the answer to the world, and it doesn't have to be. So I hope you, by listening to this, get a little bit more of an idea of what's really going on, but also get a little more familiar with the vocabulary and the specifics of how things are going on. Because it's the same Romanian guy would talk about this in Romania, where they have taken away the words and they've destroyed the meaning of words, and they've destroyed education so that you don't really know what's going on. You don't have the words to express what's going on, what's wrong with what's going on. So he was saying, even though people couldn't articulate it, they knew things were wrong. And sometimes with something like CRT and DEI, when they're saying, oh, it's not this and it is that, but it's also justice and it's also sustainability and it's also blah, 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 and it's this big mix-up of concepts, you may not know really how to articulate what is wrong with that and why you're extremely uncomfortable with it. But it doesn't mean you're wrong. And I hope this is a help to you. There's certainly been thinkers out there that were a help to me, that opened my eyes to it. And I hope I'm helping you along with that journey as well. So I hope to see you next time. Please give me a thumbs up if you like it. Leave anything in the comments if you feel like I've gotten something wrong. I'd love to hear about it. And have a nice night, and hope to see you again.